The dead of winter in Chicago always arrived with a whisper, but that Christmas Eve it came with teeth. Outside the tall, frosted windows of Lakeview House, the wind howled off the black, churning water of Lake Michigan, flinging snow against the glass like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted pine, baked ham, and the kind of strained silence that only a group of strangers forced into holiday cheer can produce. Eleanor Hayes, a woman whose 63 years had taught her the art of stillness, watched the faces around the long mahogany dining table, each one a mask lit by the flickering candelabra. She had learned long ago that the most important things were never said aloud, they were seen in the tremor of a hand reaching for a wine glass, the too quick smile that didn't touch the eyes, the subtle shift of a shoulder when a certain name was mentioned. And tonight, the air was humming with unspoken things. Margaret Doyle, the landlady, sat at the head of the table, a woman as solid and unyielding as the house she ran. Her hospitality was a rigid, formal thing, a set of rules rather than a feeling. To her right sat Colonel Richard Browning, his back ramrod straight, his face a roadmap of old battles and older disappointments. His wife, Helen, a bird-like woman with a perpetual air of nervous apology, flinched every time his voice, a low rumble of command, filled the room. Across from them, Clara Voss, a former journalist whose curiosity had long since curdled into plain nosiness, missed nothing, her sharp eyes darting from face to face, cataloguing every detail for some future, unwritten exposé. Beside her, Harvey Lennox, a businessman whose tailored suit couldn't quite conceal the scent of desperation clinging to him, laughed too loudly at the Colonel's dry jokes, his hand shaking so badly he'd already spilled wine twice. The stain on the white linen tablecloth spread like a dark premonition. Then there was Vivian Cross, a young widow whose charm was her armor and her weapon. She was effortlessly beautiful, drawing the eyes of every man in the room, particularly those of Charles Fenton, a troubled soul in his 30s with the haunted, restless eyes of a man running from something he knew he could never outpace. And finally, there was Dr. Julian Cartwright, a man of precise, almost surgical, calm, and his timid sister-in-law, Emily, who seemed to shrink into her chair whenever he glanced her way. Serving them all was Annie, the young Polish maid, her movements silent and efficient, her face a pale, unreadable mask of fatigue. More ham, Colonel. Margaret Doyle's voice cut through a lull in the conversation, sharp as a boning knife. Don't mind if I do, the Colonel boomed, holding out his plate. Best way to fight a Chicago winter is with a full belly. Helen Browning offered a weak smile. Richard has always had a healthy appetite. Her hand fluttered to her throat, a gesture Eleanor had already noted she made whenever her husband spoke. An appetite for a great many things, I'm sure. Harvey Lennox slurred slightly, raising his glass. The remark hung in the air, heavy and ambiguous. The Colonel's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, merely slicing into his ham with military precision. Eleanor watched Charles Fenton. He hadn't touched his food. His gaze was fixed on his glass of whiskey, his knuckles white where he gripped it. He seemed coiled, a spring wound too tight. Earlier, Eleanor had seen him in the hall with Lennox, their voices low and angry. Lennox had jabbed a finger into Fenton's chest. Fenton had simply stared back with a look of cold, simmering hatred. Now, at the table, a muscle jumped in Fenton's jaw. He took a long swallow of his drink, his throat working. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to catch in his chest. Are you quite all right, Mr. Fenton? Dr. Cartwright asked, his voice smooth and professional. That sounds like a rather nasty cough. Fenton shot him a glare. I'm fine, just a little something caught in my throat. He pushed his chair back abruptly. If you'll all excuse me, I have a headache. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the dining room, his steps unsteady. A sudden, uncomfortable silence descended upon the table. It was Clara Voss who broke it, her voice laced with insinuation. Poor man, he seems terribly distressed. The holidays can be such a strain for those with burdens. Vivian Cross placed her napkin on the table, her smile a perfect, polished thing. He's a sensitive soul. He feels things deeply. She had been the object of Fenton's intense, almost suffocating, attention for the past week, and Eleanor wondered if the charm was beginning to wear thin. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of forced pleasantries and hollow laughter. Tension simmered beneath the surface. Eleanor saw Helen Browning's hand tremble as she reached for her water glass. her eyes darting towards her husband, then towards Harvey Lennox. She saw the way Emily flinched when Dr. Cartwright placed a hand on her arm. A gesture that was meant to be reassuring but looked proprietary, controlling. Later, as the guests dispersed, Eleanor lingered in the doorway of the drawing room. She heard raised voices from the library, Lennox and the Colonel this time. The words were indistinct, but the tone was venomous. Something about money, a debt, a promise broken. It seemed every guest in Lakeview House was tangled in a web of secrets. As she made her way up the grand, creaking staircase to her room, she passed Fenton's door. A thin line of light shone from beneath it. She heard the clink of a glass, then a heavy sigh. The house settled into a fitful, groaning sleep, the wind its restless lullaby. Christmas morning dawned cold and unnervingly bright. The snow had stopped, blanketing the city in a pristine, deceptive peace. The guests gathered for breakfast. A smaller, more subdued group. Charles Fenton's chair was empty. Margaret Doyle, ever the stickler for punctuality, frowned. "Annie," she said, her voice sharp, "go and knock on Mr. Fenton's door. Tell him breakfast is served and won't be kept waiting." Annie scurried off, her footsteps light on the stairs. The minutes ticked by. The guests made small talk, their eyes occasionally glancing towards the doorway. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. The silence from upstairs was too profound. Annie reappeared, her face ashen. "He does not answer. Mrs. Doyle, I knock and knock. The door, it is locked." Margaret Doyle's lips tightened into a thin line. "Nonsense." She pushed herself up from the table. "I'll get the key." Probably drank himself into a stupor. The procession up the stairs felt funereal. The Colonel, Lennox, Dr. Cartwright, and Eleanor followed Margaret Doyle. The landlady's hand was steady as she inserted the master key into the lock. The click echoed in the silent hallway. She pushed the door open. The room was cold. The window was slightly ajar, letting in a sliver of frigid air. Charles Fenton was slumped in the armchair by the window, his head lolling to one side. A half-empty glass of liquor sat on the small table beside him. A faint, almost imperceptible white froth clinging to the rim. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His face was a mask of bluish repose. Dr. Cartwright was the first to move. He stepped forward, his movements quick and efficient, and pressed 2 fingers to Fenton's neck. After a moment, he straightened up, his face grim. "He's gone," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's been dead for several hours." The investigation began with the blunt efficiency of the Chicago Police Department. Detective Michael Graves was a man in his late 40s, with tired eyes that had seen too much and a crumpled suit that looked like he'd slept in it. He moved through the house with a weary sort of purpose, his questions methodical and pointed. He listened patiently as the guests gave their statements, each one a carefully constructed narrative of their evening. Suspicion, naturally, fell first on Harvey Lennox. Their public argument, the whispers of a financial dispute, it was the oldest motive in the book. "He owed me money," Lennox admitted, his bravado from the night before gone, replaced by a sweaty palmed fear. "A lot of money, but I wouldn't kill him for it. I'm not a murderer." He licked his dry lips. "I just wanted my investment back." He was reckless, throwing money away on foolish schemes. "And on Mrs. Cross?" Graves asked, his gaze sharp. Lennox flushed. "Vivian, what's she got to do with it?" Fenton was infatuated, that's all. Bought her gifts, followed her around like a lost puppy. Vivian Cross, when questioned, was the picture of tragic grace. "Charles was a dear man, but very intense," she said, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He misunderstood my friendship for something more. I tried to let him down gently." She neglected to mention the expensive diamond bracelet Eleanor had seen on her wrist. A gift from Fenton that she had certainly not rejected. The Colonel was dismissive. Fenton was a weakling, no backbone. Men like that get themselves into trouble. His wife, Helen, simply wrung her hands and said she'd barely known the man. Clara Voss, however, was a fountain of information, eagerly recounting every overheard conversation, every perceived slight, every dark look. She painted a picture of a house simmering with resentment, with Fenton at its volatile center. Eleanor remained quiet, listening, observing. She told Graves what she had seen, the argument between Lennox and Fenton, the tension at the dinner table, but she kept some things to herself. The faint froth on the glass. For one, the medical examiner had initially suggested heart failure. brought on by alcohol, but the final report was pending toxicology. To Eleanor, that froth looked wrong, unnatural, and then there was the question of the locked door. The key was on the inside. A suicide? It seemed plausible. Fenton was a desperate man. But it felt too neat. Too convenient. The house grew colder, the Christmas decorations mocking the grim reality within its walls. The guests were confined, prisoners of circumstance, their secrets beginning to fester. The fragile truce of Christmas Eve had shattered, revealing the ugly truths beneath. 2 days after Fenton's death, the tension snapped. It was Annie, the maid. She was found collapsed at the bottom of the service stairs, gasping for breath, her face contorted in agony. Dr. Cartwright was there in an instant, administering aid, his professional calm a stark contrast to the rising panic. He identified the symptoms quickly: convulsions, respiratory distress. "It's poison," he said grimly, as he worked to stabilize her. "Someone tried to kill her." Annie survived, but barely. When she could finally speak, her voice was a hoarse whisper. Detective Graves leaned in close. She muttered one word over and over again: "Letter, letter." A search of her small, sparse room revealed nothing, but the attempt on her life changed everything. This wasn't a suicide or a simple case of a brawl over money. This was something far more sinister. Fenton had been murdered, and Annie had seen something, or knew something, that made her a target. The next discovery threw the investigation into further chaos. Tucked inside a book in the library, a volume of Shakespeare's tragedies, ironically, was a threatening letter. It was written in crude, block letters, cut from a newspaper. "Stop your meddling or you'll be next." It read. It was signed with 2 initials, HB. Helen Browning. When confronted, she dissolved into a torrent of hysterical tears. "I didn't write that. I swear, I wouldn't hurt anyone," she sobbed. Clutching her husband's arm, the colonel stood by her, his face a thundercloud of rage, defending her with a ferocity that seemed more about protecting his name than his wife. Graves was skeptical. "Your husband was arguing with Lennox. Who was arguing with Fenton? There are debts, Mrs. Browning. Perhaps you were trying to protect your husband's interests." "No, it wasn't me," she insisted. Eleanor examined the letter. The paper was from the Chicago Tribune, the same newspaper the guests read every morning at the breakfast table. It felt too easy, too theatrical, like it was planted, a red herring designed to send Graves and his men chasing their tails. HB could be Helen Browning. It could also be Harvey, but his middle initial was L. It was a clumsy piece of misdirection. But who would plant it? And why? The house was a pressure cooker. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the hallway, sounded like an accusation. Eleanor found herself watching everyone, replaying conversations in her mind, searching for the discordant note. She thought about Annie. Letter. What letter? A letter Annie was supposed to deliver. A letter she had found. The toxicology report on Charles Fenton came back. The cause of death was cyanide poisoning. A fast-acting, lethal poison. The faint froth Eleanor had noticed on the glass was a characteristic sign. It wasn't a heart attack. It was cold-blooded murder. The killer was efficient, knowledgeable, and still in the house. Eleanor thought about the people in the house. Their skills, their personalities. The colonel was a man of action, not subtlety. Lennox was a desperate fool, not a calculating poisoner. Vivian was an opportunist, but murder seemed too messy for her delicate hands. Clara was a gossip, not a killer. Helen Browning was too timid, too frightened to orchestrate such a crime. That left Dr. Cartwright and his sister-in-law. Emily, the doctor, with his medical knowledge, certainly had the means. He knew about poisons. He had been the first to reach Fenton's body, the first to diagnose Annie's poisoning. He was calm, controlled, always present, too present. And Emily, the quiet, mouse-like woman who lived in his shadow. Eleanor had seen the fear in her eyes. What did she know? What was she so afraid of? Eleanor decided to set a small, quiet trap. She knew the killer was confident, arrogant even. They had outsmarted the police so far. They believed they were safe. That evening, the remaining guests gathered in the drawing room. A grim, silent assembly. The air was thick with suspicion. Eleanor, holding a cup of tea, let out a small, deliberate sigh. "It's just dreadful," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet room. "All this talk of poison. It makes one so nervous about what one eats or drinks." She took a slow sip of her tea. her eyes scanning the room over the rim of her cup. "Detective Graves was telling me about the cyanide. Such a terrible way to go. He said it has a very distinctive smell, like bitter almonds, though I'm told not everyone can detect it. A genetic quirk." She let the silence stretch. Then, she looked directly at Dr. Cartwright. "As a doctor, you must be familiar with it." "Of course." For the first time since the ordeal began, Dr. Cartwright's composure faltered. It was almost imperceptible, a slight tightening of the muscles around his mouth. A flicker in his calm, grey eyes. He cleared his throat. "Yes, of course. It's a well-known toxin. Harvey Lennox." His nerves shuddered. "God, I can almost smell it now that you mention it." Clara Voss sniffed the air theatrically. "I don't smell anything." Eleanor watched the doctor. His hand, resting on the arm of his chair, had curled into a fist. He was a man of science, a man of facts, and she had just presented him with a well-known, and entirely false, piece of information. The idea that only some people can smell cyanide is a myth. A piece of detective fiction lore. A real doctor would know that. But a man guilty of using it, a man whose mind was filled with the details of his crime, might momentarily forget the distinction between fact and fiction. He might react to the idea of being detected. But it was Emily who gave him away. As Eleanor spoke, Emily's eyes widened in terror. She shot a panicked look at Cartwright. A look that was pure, undiluted fear. It was the look of someone who knew a terrible secret, who was watching the architect of that secret walk into a trap. Eleanor felt a cold certainty settle over her. She had him. Later that night, she requested a private meeting with Detective Graves. They sat in the library, the site of so many of the house's arguments. "It's the doctor," she said quietly. Graves looked at her, his tired eyes skeptical. "Dr. Cartwright? He's been nothing but helpful. He saved the maid's life. He saved her life because he couldn't risk her dying and the police performing a full autopsy." Eleanor explained. "He only gave her enough of whatever poison he used to incapacitate her, to frighten her into silence. He needed to control the situation. He's a man who needs control." "A motive, Mrs. Hayes? Why would a respected doctor murder a man like Fenton?" "Blackmail," Eleanor said. "That's the only thing that makes sense. Fenton was a desperate man. He was running from something. But he was also looking for an angle, a way to get money. He must have uncovered something about Dr. Cartwright, something from his past that he couldn't afford to have revealed." She then told Graves about her small experiment in the drawing room. It wasn't just his reaction, detective, it was his sister-in-law, Emily. "She's terrified of him, she knows. I suspect she's been his unwilling accomplice, or at least a silent witness, for a very long time." Graves was silent for a long moment, studying her face. "It's thin, Mrs. Hayes. Is it?" She counted. "Think about it. The locked room. Fenton drinks the poisoned whiskey. A fast-acting poison. He locks the door from the inside and collapses into the chair. It looks like a perfect suicide. Who would have the knowledge to concoct such a plan? The doctor, who could get close to Fenton, perhaps offering him a drink to calm his nerves after his argument with Lennox. The doctor, who tried to silence Annie, the person who knew she might have found something incriminating. And what was Annie talking about? A letter. Eleanor leaned forward. "I don't think Annie was talking about the threatening letter in the library. I think she found another letter. The one Fenton was using to blackmail Cartwright. Perhaps she was cleaning his room, found it, and, not being able to read English well, put it aside. But the doctor saw her. He couldn't be sure what she knew, so he tried to eliminate her. He planted that fake letter pointing to Helen Browning to create confusion, to throw you off the scent. It was a theory, a web of conjecture woven from subtle observations and intuition. But it fit. It explained everything." Graves left the library without a word, but Eleanor could see a new determination in his eyes. The confrontation happened the next morning. Graves didn't accuse Cartwright directly. He started with Emily. He questioned her alone, his voice gentle but firm. It didn't take long. Trapped between a terrifying brother-in-law and the authority of the law, her fragile composure crumbled. The whole sordid story came pouring out, punctuated by desperate, racking sobs. Charles Fenton, in his reckless digging for information and leverage, had stumbled upon a dark secret from Dr. Cartwright's past. Years ago, in another city, a patient under Cartwright's care had died on the operating table. It was ruled an accident. A tragic complication. But it wasn't. It was a mistake. A moment of unforgivable negligence on Cartwright's part. Fueled by alcohol, Emily's sister, Cartwright's late wife, had known the truth. After her death, Emily became the keeper of the secret. Her silence bought with a life of comfortable dependency and veiled threats. Fenton had somehow found a letter, a confession of sorts, that Cartwright's wife had written but never sent. He saw his chance. He demanded money, a substantial sum, to keep quiet. On Christmas Eve, after his argument with Lennox, Fenton had been agitated. Dr. Cartwright had approached him, feigning concern, and offered him a drink in his room to settle his nerves. The glass contained a fatal dose of potassium cyanide, stolen from a hospital laboratory. Cartwright watched him drink it, then left, knowing the poison would work in minutes. He was a man of precision. He had calculated everything. He hadn't counted on a quiet widow who noticed things. He hadn't counted on the terrified conscience of his sister-in-law. When Graves laid it all out for him, Cartwright didn't confess. He simply stood there, his face a mask of cold, intellectual fury. The calm had finally cracked, revealing the arrogance and desperation beneath. He had believed himself untouchable, smarter than everyone, the ultimate controller, brought down by a stray letter, a maid's memory, and an old woman's quiet observation. The departure of the guests was a slow, somber affair. They left one by one, escaping the house that had become their prison. Its holiday cheer curdled into a memory of murder. Harvey Lennox, humbled and sobered, gave Eleanor a nod of grudging respect. Vivian Cross slipped away without a word, her charm for once failing her. The Brownings left together, the Colonel's bluster gone, replaced by a quiet shame. Eleanor Hayes stood at her window, watching the police car carrying Dr. Cartwright and the weeping Emily drive away. The snow had started to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that covered the tracks in the driveway, blanketing the world in white. Lakeview House stood silent against the grey sky, its windows like vacant eyes. Christmas was over, the secrets had been exhumed, the killer unmasked, but the peace that settled over the house was not the peace of the holiday season. It was the cold, empty peace of the grave. The wind howled off the lake, a mournful, lonely sound, and Eleanor Hayes pulled her shawl tighter, feeling the chill deep in her bones.